Soviet nuclear tests at Novaya Zemlya began in the early years of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union sought to assert itself as a nuclear superpower at any cost. Located deep within the Arctic Circle, this remote archipelago was chosen not because it was empty, but because it was isolated, expendable, and easy to erase from public attention. Between the 1950s and early 1960s, dozens of nuclear detonations, both atmospheric and underground, were carried out in near-total secrecy. Some of the most powerful explosions ever recorded were unleashed across frozen tundra and icy seas, including the detonation of the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon in human history. Yet, behind the spectacle of raw power lay a darker reality. Indigenous Nenets communities lived in the region, as did Soviet military personnel stationed nearby, many of whom were never informed of the risks they were being exposed to. Fallout spread across vast Arctic distances, contaminating land, water, and bodies. Soldiers were ordered to march through irradiated zones as part of readiness exercises, while civilians continued their lives unaware that invisible radiation had settled into their environment. Medical records were classified, symptoms were dismissed, and deaths were attributed to natural causes. For decades, Novaya Zemlya officially did not exist in public discourse. Maps were altered, testimonies silenced, and long-term health consequences ignored. Even after partial declassification, much of what occurred remains obscured, buried beneath layers of state secrecy. The tests achieved their military objective, but at the cost of turning an entire region into a long-term radioactive archive, one that still quietly records the human price of unchecked nuclear ambition. Castle Bravo, United States, 1954. Castle Bravo was detonated in the early morning of March 1, 1954, at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands as part of the United States' effort to perfect thermonuclear weapons. Designed as a calculated demonstration of scientific control, the test instead became one of the most severe nuclear disasters in history. American scientists had estimated a yield of 6 megatons, believing the bomb's lithium fuel would behave predictably. It did not. The explosion reached 15 megatons, instantly vaporizing entire sections of the atoll and sending a radioactive cloud far beyond the designated safety perimeter. Fallout spread across the Pacific, contaminating neighboring islands and reaching populations that had received no warning. Fine radioactive particles fell like snow, coating homes, food, and skin. Civilians, including children, unknowingly absorbed lethal doses of radiation. The military response was delayed, and evacuation came only after significant exposure had already occurred. Even U.S. servicemen involved in the operation were sent back into contaminated areas with minimal protection, many later developing severe illnesses. International outrage followed when a Japanese fishing vessel was caught in the fallout zone, leading to the death of one crew member and reigniting global fears of nuclear warfare. Despite the scale of the disaster, official statements minimized the consequences, framing the incident as an unfortunate but contained accident. Medical studies were classified, compensation was postponed, and responsibility diffused through layers of bureaucracy. Entire island communities were displaced, some permanently, as radiation rendered their homelands unsafe for generations. Castle Bravo was not a weapon used in battle, but its impact rivaled that of war itself, exposing the dangerous illusion that nuclear power could ever be fully predicted or controlled. French nuclear tests in Algeria began in 1960, at a moment when France was determined to secure its place among the world's nuclear powers while still fighting to retain control over its colonial territories. The tests were conducted deep in the Sahara Desert, near Regan and later in Eker, locations chosen for their remoteness and the assumption that little of value existed there. That assumption proved catastrophically false. Atmospheric and underground detonations were carried out with limited safety measures, exposing local populations, nomadic communities, and thousands of French soldiers to intense radiation. In some cases, troops were deliberately ordered to approach blast sites shortly after detonation to study the effects of nuclear exposure on human bodies. When underground tests fractured surrounding rock, radioactive gas escaped into the open air, drifting across desert villages without warning. Algerian civilians were neither informed nor protected, and many continued living, farming, and traveling through contaminated zones for years. After Algeria gained independence, responsibility for the damage became politically inconvenient, and records were sealed or fragmented. For decades, France denied or minimized the long-term health effects despite rising rates of cancer, birth defects, and unexplained illnesses reported by survivors. Compensation programs, when they finally appeared, were limited and burdened by strict requirements that excluded most victims. Vast areas of the desert remain contaminated, with radioactive materials buried or abandoned without proper containment. The French tests achieved their strategic purpose, but they left behind a legacy of silence, denial, and unresolved human suffering that still shadows both nations today.
British nuclear tests in Australia were carried out during the 1950s as the United Kingdom sought to maintain its status as a nuclear power in the post-war world. Remote desert regions such as Maralinga and Emu Field were selected under the assumption that they were empty and expendable. In reality, these lands were home to indigenous Aboriginal communities whose presence was ignored or deliberately concealed. Atmospheric detonations and subsequent cleanup operations released radioactive materials across vast areas, contaminating soil, water, and wildlife. Local populations were neither informed of the dangers nor adequately evacuated, and many were unknowingly exposed to long-term radiation. British and Australian personnel involved in the tests were often ordered to observe explosions at dangerously close distances with little protective equipment and minimal understanding of the risks. For years, official statements dismissed reports of illness and environmental damage as exaggerated or unrelated. Only after sustained public pressure, investigative journalism, and survivor testimony did governments begin to acknowledge the scale of the harm. By then, many affected individuals had already suffered from cancers, genetic damage, and chronic health conditions. Large portions of the test sites remained contaminated for decades, requiring extensive and costly cleanup efforts. The British tests in Australia left behind a legacy of broken trust, environmental destruction, and communities forced to live with the consequences of decisions made far from their lands and without their consent.
Chinese nuclear tests at Lop Nur began in the mid-1960s as the People's Republic of China accelerated its push to become a recognized nuclear power in a world dominated by Cold War superpowers. The Lop Nur region, located in the remote deserts of Xinjiang, was selected for its isolation, harsh climate, and limited international visibility. Between 1964 and 1996, China conducted dozens of nuclear detonations there, including atmospheric and underground tests, many of which were carried out under extreme secrecy. For years, almost no official information was released regarding the scale, frequency, or consequences of these explosions. Surrounding the test site were rural communities, farming villages, and nomadic populations who were never informed of the risks posed by radiation exposure. Fallout from atmospheric tests drifted across populated areas, contaminating water sources, crops, and livestock. Reports later emerged of unusually high cancer rates, birth defects, and premature deaths among residents living downwind of the site, though direct medical links were difficult to prove due to missing data and restricted access. Medical studies, if conducted, were not publicly shared, and affected families had little recourse or recognition. Soldiers and workers involved in the testing program were also exposed, often without adequate protection, and their health records remain largely inaccessible. Even after China signed international agreements to halt nuclear testing, Lop Nur remained closed to independent investigation. Today, much of what occurred there exists only through survivor accounts, limited academic research, and fragmented disclosures. The site stands as a reminder that nuclear secrecy does not erase consequences, it merely delays their acknowledgement, leaving entire regions to bear silent and unresolved damage long after the explosions have faded from the sky. Project 4.1 Marshall Islands. Project 4.1 was initiated in the aftermath of American nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, presented publicly as a scientific effort to understand the effects of radiation exposure. In reality, it became one of the most ethically troubling studies of the nuclear age. Following massive thermonuclear detonations at Bikini and Eniwetok atolls, entire island populations were exposed to radioactive fallout without their knowledge or consent. Instead of prioritizing evacuation and treatment, U.S. authorities began quietly monitoring the affected residents as research subjects. Medical teams conducted regular examinations, collected blood samples, and documented symptoms, while withholding full explanations of what was happening or why. Islanders were told they were receiving routine health care, even as their bodies were being studied for radiation effects. Over time, residents developed thyroid disorders, cancers, reproductive complications, and genetic abnormalities, particularly among children born after the tests. Many were relocated multiple times, forced to live on contaminated or resource-poor islands, further compounding physical and psychological trauma. Reports produced under Project 4.1 remained classified for years, and when fragments were later revealed, they showed a focus on data collection rather than patient welfare. Compensation was slow, inconsistent, and often insufficient, leaving survivors to navigate long-term illness with limited support. Project 4.1 was not an accidental consequence of nuclear testing, but a deliberate decision to observe human suffering as scientific evidence. It exposed a chilling reality of the Cold War era, that entire communities could be reduced to experiments, their lives reshaped not by war, but by secrecy, power, and indifference. Soviet nuclear tests near populated villages were a hidden chapter of the Cold War that few outside the USSR would learn about for decades. While the world focused on massive showpiece detonations like Tsar Bomba, smaller-scale tests were carried out alarmingly close to civilian areas, often without warning or evacuation. Both atmospheric and underground explosions released radioactive dust and gases into the air, sometimes carried by prevailing winds into towns and farmlands. Residents reported sudden illnesses, hair loss, and unexplained rashes, but local doctors were often powerless to diagnose or treat the radiation-related conditions. Soldiers stationed nearby were frequently ordered to approach freshly irradiated zones as part of readiness exercises, with minimal protective equipment and little understanding of the dangers. The state tightly controlled all information. Local media were forbidden from reporting anything unusual, and scientific studies documenting the long-term health consequences were classified. Even decades later, surviving witnesses speak of children born with severe deformities, families lost to cancers, and landscapes scarred by radioactive contamination. What makes these tests particularly disturbing is the deliberate opacity. Government planners prioritized military advancement over human life, treating entire villages as invisible collateral. Maps were altered, records destroyed, and warnings suppressed. For generations, the true cost of these experiments remained hidden, leaving a lingering shadow over the affected communities, a silent testament to how nuclear ambition could reach far beyond designated test sites and reshape the lives of ordinary people without acknowledgement or redress. Underwater nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean were among the most destructive and secretive experiments of the early nuclear era, carried out primarily by the United States and, to a lesser extent, other powers seeking to understand the behavior of nuclear explosions in marine environments. These tests involved detonating nuclear devices beneath the surface of lagoons, bays, and open ocean, producing massive water columns, shock waves, and radiation plumes that spread far beyond the immediate blast zone. Entire marine ecosystems were devastated. Coral reefs shattered, fish populations disappeared, and seabirds and mammals were killed or contaminated. Yet the true scale of environmental destruction was hidden from the public, as official reports downplayed or ignored the long-term consequences. Fishermen, local island communities, and military personnel involved in operations were often exposed to fallout without adequate protection, suffering illnesses, burns, and radiation sickness. The tests also revealed unexpected dangers. Underwater detonations created massive radioactive waves that traveled farther than anticipated, and radioactive debris sank into the ocean floor, creating long-lasting contamination that remains largely unmonitored even decades later. Governments classified detailed data, citing national security, leaving scientists, environmentalists, and the affected populations in the dark. The Pacific, once a symbol of natural beauty and abundance, became a laboratory for destructive experimentation, its invisible scars a haunting reminder of humanity's willingness to sacrifice both ecosystems and human life in pursuit of nuclear knowledge and strategic advantage. Even today, some areas remain hazardous, and the full ecological impact of these tests is still only partially understood, revealing the ocean as both witness and victim of human ambition gone unchecked.
Alleged Israeli nuclear tests remain one of the most enigmatic and controversial episodes in modern nuclear history. Unlike other nations, Israel has never officially confirmed the existence of a nuclear weapons program, yet intelligence reports, satellite imagery, and whistleblower accounts have long suggested that secret tests and experiments were conducted, likely beginning in the late 1960s and continuing in subsequent decades. Locations are believed to have been carefully chosen, hidden in remote desert regions or within underground facilities, designed to avoid international detection and scrutiny. Unlike tests in other countries, almost no direct evidence has ever been released publicly, leaving historians and analysts to rely on fragmentary leaks, circumstantial observations, and the testimony of insiders. The potential scope and impact of these tests remain unknown, though some reports suggest small-scale detonations may have occurred to validate weapon design or radiation yield. Civilian populations, if present, were likely kept far from danger, but the secrecy surrounding the operations leaves unanswered questions about long-term environmental and health consequences. What makes these alleged tests particularly compelling is their deliberate invisibility. An entire nuclear program may have been refined in silence, with no acknowledgement, no casualties publicly recorded, and no official documentation. The absence of transparency has created a historical void where speculation dominates and the line between confirmed fact and rumor blurs. For decades, Israel's nuclear capabilities have existed in a state of shadow, a silent power whose existence is inferred rather than confirmed, a reminder that not all nuclear history is written in open records or visible explosions, and some of the most potent weapons may have been forged entirely in secrecy.
Covert joint Cold War nuclear tests were a hidden chapter of the 20th century, carried out by alliances of superpowers under a veil of secrecy that left entire populations unaware of the risks they were being subjected to. While publicly, the United States, the Soviet Union, and other nuclear states often claimed to conduct independent tests for national security, declassified documents and intelligence reports suggest that numerous experiments were coordinated covertly, sharing knowledge, technology, and even personnel in ways never admitted to the public. These secret collaborations often took place in remote deserts, Arctic archipelagos, and isolated ocean regions, chosen to minimize observation but not always to prevent exposure. Local populations, military personnel, and even scientists were sometimes placed in harm's way without full disclosure of the dangers, creating silent victims of experimentation whose suffering remained unrecorded for decades. The explosions themselves ranged from underground detonations meant to study seismic effects to atmospheric blasts that contaminated soil, water, and air over wide areas, sometimes drifting across borders and creating international incidents that were quietly managed behind closed doors. The purpose of these joint tests extended beyond simple weapon development. They were intended to understand the interplay of nuclear power, radiation dispersal, and environmental impact under controlled yet unpredictable circumstances, essentially turning human and natural ecosystems into experimental laboratories. Decades later, much of the evidence remains classified or heavily redacted, leaving historians, scientists, and affected communities to piece together fragments of what occurred. These covert joint tests illustrate a Cold War world in which secrecy, competition, and collaboration coexisted in an uneasy, morally ambiguous dance, where the drive for knowledge and strategic advantage often overshadowed any concern for life or environment, leaving legacies of contamination, illness, and unanswered questions that endure to this day.